Welcome to Coffee and U.S. History in the Kitchen with Mr. Evans. And today, as usual, I'm going to drop a whole bunch of truth bombs on you. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most famous and in some ways misunderstood person in American history. What was it that made George Washington such a great general? Imagine with me.
Run away!
Far more battles than he won. And the one thing that Washington was really good at was living to fight another day. So today we're going to talk about the American Revolution, and we're going to talk about big loss and 3 big wins. Washington, early in the war, has his troops stationed near New York. He's trying to maintain control of New York City. The British have him outgunned and outnumbered, and Washington makes a foolish attempt to try to hold Long Island. And the British surround Washington's troops. They are closing in on him, and the only thing that saves Washington is the sun goes down. And in those days, they normally didn't do a lot of fighting at night, especially, the British had superior forces. So they decide to hunker down for the evening, and they figure they will take out Washington and the colonial army the next morning. And the whole war could have been over right then and there. Washington has campfires set, so it looks like the colonials are also hunkering down for the night. And he gets boats ready. And just as it's getting really dark, the fog rolls in. And this would lead Washington to believe, and many of his soldiers, right, that Providence or God was on their side. Because had it not been for the thick fog, they might not have survived. And they load up on all these boats. There's not enough for everybody, so they have to make several trips. And they escape across the river. And the British do not realize until the morning when they show up and see that there's just a bunch of campfires that are empty with nobody around them, that the colonials have escaped in the middle of the night. It's similar to the escape from Dunkirk in World War II, if you remember that part of your history. I mean, this is a huge deal, not because Washington wins. He loses badly, and the British wind up taking control of New York City and most of New York State very quickly. But he escapes with the army intact to live and fight another day. One of the points I want to get across today is, as obvious as it is now, what a huge hero Washington's going to be, and that he was the right man for the job. At the time, in the 1770s, right, it was not a unanimous decision. There were a lot of people who didn't think Washington was the best person to be in charge. And there were a lot of people in his own army who wanted his job, who wanted to be the top commander. Right? And some of them were pretty ruthless and treacherous about this. So one of them is a guy named Charles Lee. Lee was in command of another army in New York. And even though Washington escaped, the British are still only a few days behind him, and they're chasing him across New York. And so Washington sends a letter to Lee saying, look, I need you to bring your troops up here and join with me and reinforce me in case the British catch up to me and we have to have a major battle. Well, Lee drags his feet, and historians have debated whether he was actually outright defying orders or not, but certainly he knew Washington's intent was for him to come join him, and Lee moves his army at an incredibly slow pace. And it seems as if Lee is basically hoping Washington will get killed by the British, and so that he can then be named the new commander-in-chief of the colonial army. Well, there's a little bit of cosmic karma to the universe, however. And I think Lee's lack of character catches up to him. Another problem for Lee was he was one of these guys who didn't want to eat what the soldiers ate, didn't like sitting in camp with his own soldiers. And so Lee leaves his soldiers, goes into town to a restaurant so he can have a meal and be indoors. And while he happens to be sitting there writing a letter to Horatio Gates complaining about how horrible a commander George Washington is, the British roll up and capture him. And Lee spends many, many months in prison until there's a prisoner exchange later on and he can finally get his freedom. So Lee's lack of character, right, and his undermining of Washington and his unwillingness to live like a regular soldier during battle catches up to him, and he winds up disgraced and in prison and does not, and few people in history even remember him. Actually, things are not going very good for Washington, right? His own officers are undermining him. He's lost his first major battle in New York. The British chase him down to Pennsylvania. And most importantly, winter is getting close. 1776 is almost over. And a lot of the soldiers, their contract is up on January 1st, right? They have signed a contract for a year or 2 years. And their official service to the army is over with very soon. And it's expected that many of them are just going to go home, go back to their farms because Congress hasn't been paying them. So Washington knows he needs to do something. Something to keep these guys in the army and keep them all from just giving up. So he kind of rolls the dice and plans a very risky attack. In the middle of the night, they are going to cross the Delaware River and attack. They're going to attack the German Hessians in the town of Trenton. The weather is horrible that night, which might have helped conceal their attack, but also made it dangerous just to get across the river. It's freezing cold. It sets them behind schedule. But Washington makes this famous attack in the icy cold, in the middle of the night, across the Delaware River, and it works.
Onward across the Delaware for the glory of the 13 colonies and a push.
It's his first major victory. They've captured Trenton, and the political impact of this victory is what is so important because it brings new recruits into the army, and many of the men who probably were getting ready to go home within the week decide to re-enlist for another year. Second major win after Trenton doesn't involve Washington. It is the Battle of Saratoga. The British plan is to break the colonies in half, and so they hope to do that by controlling the Hudson River. This will separate, right, the troublemakers in New York and New England from the rest of the colonies. The British general, a guy named Burgoyne, is arrogant, cocky, and he writes a letter back home saying that he bets he will win the war before Christmas. So as he's marching up the state of New York, the colonists, the advantage they have is they know the geography and the terrain, and they can pick a good place to make their stand, a good spot where they have a defensive tactical advantage. And Burgoyne essentially walks right into their trap. However, Burgoyne has more troops, and they're better seasoned troops. And so early on, the fight is kind of a stalemate. And in fact, at one point, it looks like the British, despite walking into basically an ambush, still might win this victory. And at this point, a young officer named Benedict Arnold rallies his troops to charge directly at a group of the British. And Arnold is shot in the leg. He falls off his horse, and his horse lands on him. And so between the bullet wound and the horse crushing his leg, Benedict Arnold is going to have a hard time walking for the rest of his life, and he's going to walk with a limp. But the charge works, and that little mini battle helps determine the larger battle of Saratoga. This battle is important for political reasons, because when word of the American victory at Saratoga gets back to France, it is going to help encourage the French to support the 13 colonies in this war, and they are going to finally get involved. Some more truth bombs. So Horatio Gates was the American commander in charge, and while Benedict Arnold is recuperating from his leg wound, Gates takes credit for the big victory and leaves Arnold essentially out of the report altogether. So Arnold develops a bitterness. He should have been the hero of Saratoga. And in fact, had Arnold been killed that day, had he been shot in the heart instead of the leg, we might remember him as one of our great American heroes from the Revolutionary War. However, here is where Benedict Arnold's lack of character comes out, just like Charles Lee. Truth bomb time. At the moment that these things are happening, sometimes character doesn't seem to matter. But how you are remembered throughout history often is determined by your character. And so in this case, Arnold's lack of character leads him to plot with the British. Arnold eventually is put in charge of the fort at West Point, and Arnold is secretly planning to hand the fort over to the British. His plot is foiled, however, when his contact, his British spy contact, is captured. Arnold escapes and goes to serve with the British Army. But the British don't fully trust him either, and so he's never really promoted to a high position in the British Army. And throughout American history, Benedict Arnold's name has become synonymous with traitor. And can you imagine 250 years from now, when people say your name, it means the same thing as traitor? That's what it means if you call somebody a Benedict Arnold. In the South, Britain's strategy had been early in the war to not devastate the colonies as much. They thought there were more loyalists in the South. Plus, let's face it, there's a certain resource the British really wanted to get from the South. Can you name it? Yes, that's right, cotton. Right? A lot of the textile mills in England are reliant on this cotton coming from the southern colonies. And so early in the war, they're not trying to just destroy towns and level them and punish them harshly like they do in Boston, Massachusetts. But the colonists in the South are fighting guerrilla warfare style. And so the general in the South, Cornwallis, has been chasing them all across the South. And of course, there's a little battle, and then the colonists pull a Washington and run away. Cornwallis is having a hard time lugging these big, heavy cannons around, which make his army slower. And he decides to hunker down for the winter. And he chooses a spot that's a peninsula connected to the Chesapeake Bay. It's the Yorktown Peninsula. And this is a horrible military choice looking back. But in fairness to Cornwallis, he believed he would be safe pinning himself in a corner like this because the British Navy up till now has been so dominant, and he figures any kind of supplies he needs can be brought in by the British Navy, and worst case scenario, he could always evacuate using the British Navy. Washington realizes this may be his chance to win the war. Now that he has French cannons and the French Navy, Cornwallis has allowed himself to get trapped on a peninsula where he has no room to maneuver. He's put himself in a corner, basically. Well, Washington marches down immediately, and they surround the British troops on this tiny little area. Throughout the war, Washington's stepson has wanted to be involved in the fighting, and Washington has discouraged him from that. But at this point, Washington realizes this could be the battle that decides the war. And so he allows his stepson to join him and become one of his aides-de-camps for the Yorktown battle. The first few days, the colonists bombard the British. With the help of the French, the American troops actually outnumber the British, probably for the first time in the war. Cornwallis sends desperate letters hoping that they get through to New York, where the British have reinforcements and could come down and rescue him. What Cornwallis doesn't know is the French Navy has blockaded the Chesapeake, and they are blocking the British Navy from coming to rescue him, as he figured his safety net would always be there for him. After 7 or 8 days of bombarding the British, Cornwallis realizes he has no way out, and the colonists are simply going to close in and close in and close in until Cornwallis agrees to surrender. It was traditional in those days that the surrendering general would offer his sword to the victorious general as a sign of respect. The next day, when the ceremony is supposed to take place, Cornwallis claims to be too sick to attend. He's basically just too embarrassed. He can't admit he lost to Washington. And there are several of Washington's aides who get really upset and feel like, you know what, well, we shouldn't accept their surrender there, and maybe we should just keep fighting and kill them. But Washington's humbleness, his character, comes through. And Washington says, no, it may be an insult to me, but I can take it. And, as long as we won the victory, it's fine. The next day, Cornwallis does surrender more appropriately, by the way. But Cornwallis's reaction is typical of the reaction of the entire British Empire. They simply could not believe, right, that they had lost. And in fact, as the British soldiers are coming out, they're laying down their arms and surrendering. Their musicians, their drummers, decide to play the song, "The World Turned Upside Down," because that's what it felt like to them. They simply could not imagine in their wildest dreams that they had been defeated. One of the things that we'll see throughout history, unfortunately, is oftentimes, sometimes when people are at the height of their professional success, when we would think this would be the moment when they would be the most happy, right? And you would think this would be that moment for Washington. But it's often at this time when some of our leaders face their greatest personal tragedies. And in this case, it's Washington's stepson. He caught one of the camp diseases and dies shortly after the victory at Yorktown. And so George has to, tell his wife Martha that her son has died. The British technically still had troops in New York City, and the war would not officially end for quite some time. But Yorktown is essentially the battle that wins the war for the colonies. It takes all the fight and all the stomach out of England. So how did this scrappy group of colonists defeat the world's greatest empire? Or if we want to flip it around the other way, how did the British manage to lose this war when they had all the advantages? Well, obviously it starts with their generals. They were arrogant and made quite a few bad decisions because they counted on their superiority. Poor communication. And this might be a little bit related to the arrogance, but in many of these battles, the British had reinforcements not that far away. They had the ability to bring their navy to bear, and they failed to do that because they didn't have good communication lines set up. And although the British managed to control some of the large cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston, they failed to control the countryside. They failed to win the hearts and minds of the majority of the colonists. Certainly there were some loyalists. There were some that remained devoted to the king. But the longer this war drug on, the more opportunity there was for the colonists to recruit, especially in the smaller towns and the countrysides. One big loss and 3 big wins. We'll see you next time on Coffee and U.S. History in the Kitchen.